Well, welcome back, and let's get straight into our extended conversation with my special guest, Daniel Hannan, who will be joining us from London in a moment. First, a few necessary preliminaries. I'm Nick Cater, the presenter of Battleground on ADH TV, a safe harbour for rational and fearless discussion in a dismal and dispiriting sea of absurdity. ADH is free via the web, adh.tv, or better still, via the dedicated ADH app, which you can download on your smartphone or smart TV. And of course, this show, along with most of the content, is available as an audio podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favourite podcast platform. Lord Hannan is an outspoken member of the House of Lords, a writer, a journalist, and a former politician. He's a member of the Conservative Party. He was a member of the European Parliament for South East England from 1999 to 2020. He played a prominent role in the Brexit campaign and stood down from the European Parliament when he succeeded and the UK exited from the EU in 2020. I think it exited. I'll check that point with Dan later. His writing is published in the Sunday Telegraph in the UK, the International Business Times, Conservative Home, Washington Examiner, and as well as occasional columns in everything from the Daily Mail to the Spectator and the Wall Street Journal. He's published several books, including Inventing Freedom, How the English-Speaking Peoples Made the Modern World. Dan, welcome. It's great to have a chance to talk to you again after you were here briefly in January.
It's great to be with you, Nick. Hi.
You were writing that book, by the way, to acknowledge there's something very special and empowering in the idea of freedom as it evolved in Britain over centuries, I guess, and Australia was fortunate enough to inherit those values. They've served us very well, I have to say. But you were in Australia in January, so you would be familiar with the sly campaign to abolish our National Day and ban practically any display of pride for our country or its inheritance. You're an outsider, of course, impeccably impartial, if I can say so. Are we being rather too bashful about this nation's achievements?
Without question. Few nations have achievements to match Australia's. And it's really important to understand that these campaigns to ban the National Day or to take down the statues of Cook or Macquarie or whatever it is, are not about history. They're about the present and about advancing a particular political agenda today. So I'd go further than you did in that little introduction. Nick, I don't think Australia was just fortunate to be founded in the common law Anglophone tradition. I think Australia intensified and exaggerated a lot of the things that distinguished Anglophone culture in the British Isles. I know this may sound funny if you look at it from an Australian perspective, because obviously Australia, which went further with the individualism, with the classlessness, with the lack of deference, with the supreme emphasis on the autonomy of the citizen, may look back on Britain as a kind of relatively feudal, class-ridden place. But that isn't how Britain was seen by any contemporary country. If you look at it from a French or a Spanish or a Russian point of view, Australia took the libertarianism, the localism, if you like, the almost republican tendency, and took it further. And that, I think, is what is in the crosshairs of the people who don't want to mark Australia Day or don't want to use the word Australia or want to splatter the paintings, the statues with paint. Because what they're really saying is the world would have been a better place if Anglophone Australia had not come into being. And that, of course, is a preposterous assertion. Few countries have been on the right side so consistently. But they can't admit that Australia succeeded through market capitalism and this emphasis on the individual. And so they have to pretend that Australia somehow owes its wealth to exploitation or, brutalizing indigenous people or something. It's nothing to do with history, and it's everything to do with advancing a collectivist agenda in the present.
Let's go back to this thing about national pride, because perhaps I feel it more strongly as an immigrant, albeit one who's been here well over 30 years now, that this is a very special place. And I was somewhat miffed, I have to say, when Tennis Australia banned any mention of Australia Day during the Australian Open tournament. It issued a statement that said, in part, "We are mindful that there are differing views, and at the Australian Open we are inclusive and respectful of all," close quotes. Well, national pride is apparently an inappropriate emotion at the Australian Open of all places, but rainbow pride, that's a different story. Let's take a look at this video. Now, I don't know if any of those look like competitors in the women's or the men's final, for that matter. But look, my worry here, Dan, is not this, this rather cute sports-themed cross-dressing or the corny video or the doof-doof music. It's that we're losing our sense of what we share as equal citizens of this nation and immersing ourselves instead in what divides us.
Right. The whole essence of national pride, the whole essence of Australia Day is we've all got this citizenship in common, like any other country. In order to you could argue, especially in a settler country like Australia, where people come with different national traditions, different languages, different ethnicities, it is incredibly important to say, but these are the things we have in common. And that involves citizenship and it involves values. Free speech, free association, the elevation of the individual over the collective and all the rest of it. And it's extraordinary that instead of doing that, we are sacralizing certain, almost at random, certain kind of identity, politics, woke values. And so we've moved now, I say this as someone who was, I have lived as you have through an era where gay people have finally been granted complete equality before the law. That didn't happen just with the decriminalisation of same-sex acts. There was further to go before you had complete equality in terms of inheritance rights and hospital visiting rights and so on. And that has happened, right? But this pride is nothing to do with that now. Pride is about you will celebrate or else. There was an American hockey player, a Russian-born guy called Ivan Pomarov, who declined to join in wearing a sort of pride-themed thing in his ice hockey team in Philadelphia, and immediately was cancelled. Right now, how extraordinary that we've gone from the liberal ideal of let's treat everyone the same to this incredibly illiberal ideal of if you don't join in, if you don't pay homage to this new semi-compulsory celebration, then you will be ostracized and you will be professionally damaged. And that is the opposite of what the people who originally were campaigning with pride marches wanted. A point, by the way, made by our friend Douglas Murray, who also lived through this and lived through it as a gay man. It is striking that the corporates who are now piling in with this mandatory celebration of LGBT rights were actually nowhere to be seen when it really mattered, when it was a controversial thing to get equality before the law.
That's exactly right. But look, this is where I'm leading. If we're going to surrender the idea that we are first and foremost citizens of our respective countries, and that we accord other citizens equal respect, that we're bound together by the fact that this country is actually pretty good, and we put the emphasis instead on diversity, are we in danger of slipping back into some form of tribalism?
Yes, I think that is the most obvious danger, because human beings are not designed for a large, complex nation state with tens of millions of citizens. Human beings are evolved in kin groups and designed for quite small tribal relations, and are generally governed by the ethic, or for a million years before civilization, we're governed by the ethic of my tribe good, your tribe bad. So we are, if you like, we are attuned to vendetta and blood feud and a certain kind of xenophobia, if you like, to people not from the tribe. Now, the miracle of the nation state is to extend the feelings of common fellowship to people that we haven't met yet, right? To people that we don't know, but we feel a kinship with because we share these values, these aspects of citizenship. And that's why, why do we pay taxes to support people that we've never met? patriotism, right? A sense of common nationhood. Why do we obey laws which we think are stupid laws? Same thing, right? Because we accept the verdict of the majority. Why come to that? Do we accept an election result when our party loses? It's something that both of us have recently experienced, because we don't immediately say, I'm seceding, right, because I refuse to accept the validity of these idiots. We say, all right, a majority of our fellow countrymen have made this decision, and we feel enough in common with them that we will accept the verdict. Now, you take that away, and people will very quickly devolve into squabbling tribes again, especially in a place where you have people who have different national and ethnic backgrounds. And so it's not just irritating, this is incredibly dangerous, because if you undermine the concept of shared citizenship, you open the door to a complete impossibility of maintaining an open society and civil freedoms with it.
Now, you gave a speech last year to a think tank in Guernsey where you illustrated exactly this point by referring to the opening sentence in the movie The Godfather, which I couldn't remember at the time. But I'll ask Charlie to play the clip and then you can jump in and tell us the rest of the story.
I believe in America. America has made my fortune.
Take it from there, Dan.
Right, so the opening line, spoken before the camera has come on. It's spoken against a blank screen, I believe in America. Right? And that is the Undertaker, who has been the model successful immigrant, has done everything right, obeyed the law, paid his taxes, and built up a successful business, and has now suffered this terrible injustice. His daughter has been assaulted, and the culprits, who we are given to understand have political connections, have been let off with a token sentence. And he is now coming to the Godfather, played by Marlon Brando, to ask for justice. And what you see here is the difference between a civil conception of nationhood and the more traditional tribal system represented by the Godfather. The Undertaker, a world of laws and courts. Why have I not been justly treated? The Godfather, are you on my side? And Marlon Brando keeps on, for a long time they don't understand each other. If you remember the movie, Marlon is going, hey, you show me no respect, hey, you don't call me Godfather, even though your wife and mine are friends, right? And eventually, the Undertaker gets what is being asked of him, and he says, look, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? I'm on your team now. Someday, it may be that day will never come. I'm going to ask you for a favor, right? Now, here's the thing. You could not make a movie out of the successful Undertaker running his business, right? Because we are on a very deep genetic level programmed to the tribal values represented by the Godfather. That's what makes the movie. The good guys and bad guys defined, I mean, they're all mafia crooks, right? Defined by which is presented as our tribe, right? And that, if you think about it, is the essence of almost every film. You know, Star Wars or Harry Potter or whatever. It's taken as read that there are goodies and baddies. Nobody ever goes into the complexity of motive. You couldn't easily make a movie out of a complex and multifaceted modern society. And this is then the great genius of Mario Puzo and of the directors of the film. The Undertaker's name, right? The guy who represents this complex, law-based and non-ethnic, non-vendetta-based society. He's called Amerigo Buonasera. Good night, America, right? When Marlon Brando gets his way, the thing that made America possible ceases to exist. And I think that is the most beautiful encapsulation on screen, because it reminds us of what tribal creatures we are, of how fragile and how precious and how contingent a modern civil society is.
We could talk about that movie all night, Dan, but we must move on. When you were here in early February, we talked about the COVID-19 pandemic, and I think we both agreed that we were shaken by the ease and the speed with which our respective countries fell from being liberal democratic governments into governments that ruled by fear and decree. What went wrong?
Well, I mean, the story of the growth of the state, in a way, is the story of a series of crises which leave people frightened and the state is then very reluctant to give back, when the emergency passes, the powers that it had assumed on a supposedly contingent basis. We also, I think, we reminded ourselves of just how tribal and authoritarian we are. And I mean that really in the sort of most rounded sense. Part of the ugliness of the lockdowns was the way in which people became intolerant of eccentrics or outliers. There was this vicious response towards people who left the house too often, or the people literally were sort of sneaking to the police on, my neighbor has already been out for her morning walk. But there was also a good side to it, and this is why we need to understand why this thing is so wretchedly popular, because a time like a national crisis like that gives people a sense of shared purpose, of common solidarity. We're all in it together. There are no strangers now. We're all family. So if you like it's also the positive recreation of tribes. So along with all the horrible prissiness and puritanism and sneaking, there were people, volunteering and doing things to the people who were self-isolating and so on. And that's what people miss, And one of the things that I just find almost, is that the most wounding and horrible thing is you still get it from people. I'm sure you do as well. Is when people sort of sidle up to you slightly furtively and say, "Do you know, I rather miss the lockdown. We had we all ate together as families, and there were no planes in the sky, and when we remembered what was important about life, and we didn't have to commute and all the rest of it." Well, look, let's take it as read that all of us would rather play with the kids than commute. But the point about the lockdown was that it was coercive, right? There is nothing to stop you now from, if that's what you want to do, from working shorter hours and foregoing a holiday or whatever. The awfulness of the lockdown is that it was imposing your preferences on all of your neighbours. And I'm afraid that did prove horribly appealing to people, which is why the pendulum is not swinging back. A lot of people, they never want it to end.
We've had some unflattering insights into what happened in Britain recently through the release of the WhatsApp messages of former Health Secretary Matt Hancock. I feel sorry for Matt in one sense. None of us would like all our emails exchanges and text message exchanges sent out to the national press. But anyway, in one exchange, Hancock messages an aide to suggest, quote, "We frightened the pants off everyone with a new strain." And the advisor responds, "Yep, that's what we'll do to get proper behaviour change." And then the minister asks, "When do we deploy the new variant?" And apparently Hancock announced the variant the following day. And in another separate conversation from January 2021, when lockdown measures were in full swing, Hancock discusses a possible easing of restrictions with the head of the civil service, Simon Case. And Case warns against making any changes, saying they'd make Hancock look ridiculous. He talks about ramping up messaging, adding the fear-guilt factor. That just reaffirms my worst fears, if you like, Dan.
Right. It confirms everything we thought at the time.
Not only were people frightened, and understandably so, of this new variant, which we'd been told was a terrible thing, but politicians and senior public servants were actually trying to make that fear worse. What do we make of that?
Exactly. Nobody emerges with much credit from these leaks. Obviously, Matt Hancock doesn't. I think that the journalist who leaked it all, having been given it to write a memoir with, has questions to answer about professional integrity. But I think the people who emerge worst are the blob, if you like, what the Americans would call the administrative state, the unelected permanent bureaucracy that runs the country, who constantly and systematically overestimated the danger and underperformed when it came to acquiring masks or PPE or whatever. We saw laid bare just how hopeless the state is. I'll tell you what really surprised me reading through these messages. Look, it's legitimate to say that a scary thing is scary, right? There's nothing wrong with an advert that says smoking can kill you or whatever, if smoking really can kill you. That's a legitimate thing. I'm not arguing with that. But what is amazing to, I think, anyone who comes fresh to these messages is the utter banality and trivia, I was hoping that we would find in there some sense that they knew what was going on, and that even if they were messaging it differently, that they were saying, look, we know that this new variant is going to do X and Y. This is why we're going to have to present it like this. This is what our, behavioral psychologists tell us is the most effective way of doing it. We don't see that at all. We see a bunch of frightened people, obsessed with how they're going to come out of it, obsessed with headlines, swapping, tweets and news reports with each other. You see how ill-informed and how the people in the machine, not just the ministers, but all of the people whose job is to know about this, they didn't know any more than you or I did, right? Which is why it was, in retrospect, actually, no, not just in retrospect, at the time, it was unforgivable to respond in the way they did, ruining children's education, condemning old people to isolation. We've forgotten the utter madness. I mean, you had a bit of it in Melbourne particularly, but, the people being moved on for sitting on park benches, the police in Derbyshire poured dye into a lake to stop people visiting it. They were sending drones up to penalise hikers in the Dales. Why? A, because of this taste for authoritarianism, and B, because all of the incentives push you towards overreaction. And this is not in retrospect. I remember saying this not just at the time, but before the time. I remember writing a piece in February, before the lockdown had begun, saying the trouble with something like this is that every politician and every health advisor will calculate that it doesn't matter how wrong they are if they are overcautious. They can spend trillions on something that turns out to be useless, and they won't be held to account, which, by the way, was true, right? The emergency hospitals that we built that stood empty, the lockdowns that achieved nothing. But if they are a millimetre wrong the other way, that could be career-ending. So all of the incentives will push them into overreaction. Now, I am now confident in saying that I think empirically that was correct. And the reason I say that is that this week, the one figure you can't manipulate, which is the excess mortality rate for all of Europe, has been compiled. Different countries measured COVID deaths in different ways. Some attribute anyone who had COVID and then died of something else as a COVID fatality, some don't, so there were different methodologies. The one thing you can't fake, because it's a consistent methodology and it's consistent internationally, is how many extra people died than you would have expected to die over that period, right? That's nothing to do with differences in how you measure it. And you know which country had the lowest excess mortality between 2020 and 2022 in the whole of Europe? Sweden, right? Yeah. The one country that didn't lock down, that kept its schools open, that kept its shops open. Now, I was expecting, honestly, when the lockdown was on, I thought, okay, Sweden will suffer a slightly higher mortality rate, but will not have a smoking crater where its economy used to be. And that will, in retrospect, turn out to have been the right call. What I now see is that not only did Sweden make the right call in terms of freedom and prosperity, but that the lockdowns killed people, right? That letting people pursue a normal life was actually better for their health, not just for their mental health afterwards, but literally for their survival, than crowding people indoors and denying them exercise during this period. And so I really hope in Australia, as in the UK, that the inquiries will look at this properly, and that they won't just start from the presumption of why didn't we lock down sooner or why didn't we stop international flights or whatever, but that they will look at, are we geared up as governments to overreact in this way? Because for God's sake, let's not do this again. We know now that the politicians love doing it. We know that the public secretly enjoys it or openly enjoys it. But we also know that it is catastrophic, both for our freedom and for the welfare of our young people.
But Dan, you say the inquiries in Australia. There are virtually no inquiries in Australia. I don't know whether we've taken a different path post-COVID. And you raise, of course, that issue of excess mortality, which is really very, very underreported in this country, and I think generally around the world. It's like nobody wants to go there or talk about it. And there's another whole complex, discussion, and it involves a lot more knowledge of medical science than I know about the reasons for that uplift in excess deaths. It's not quite easy to pin it, but putting all that aside, why is it that we can't at least, I mean, even on the conservative side of politics, we don't seem to be able to get politicians to stand up and be able to say, well, at least the lockdowns were wrong and they led to extremely poor economic consequences, social consequences, and so forth. We will not do those again. We've tried it and we won't do it again. But I can't actually hear anybody in this country saying that.
Well, I mean, we have got one or two people saying that here, including me. But the problem I suspect that they face, any elected politician faces, is that is an incredibly unpopular message. It would be like turning around in December 1918 and saying this whole thing was for nothing. We shouldn't have joined this war. It was disastrous, and all of our young people, heroic as their deaths were, have died in advance of no useful cause, whatever. Now, there is a strong argument that that was true, but you weren't able to make that argument until the 60s, when the last of the veterans was no longer there to insult, if you like, right? And I think in the same way, obviously nothing like the same trauma, but and nothing like the same mortality rates or anything like that, but the same instinct is there of saying we can't bear to admit that this was for nothing. You know, in the UK, as in Australia, the lockdown was wildly popular, initially at any rate, and the people who supported it, and didn't just support it, but demanded it, and policed and invigilated it in their own communities, cannot now bring themselves to accept that it was for nothing, that the undiagnosed cancer, the debt, the traumatized children, the stroppy teenagers with the outbreak of mental health problems, and the economic sluggishness that we've condemned ourselves to for years, maybe for a decade as a result, was all an overreaction. And so I have some sympathy with the politician who doesn't want to stand up, even if he realizes that, and rub people's nose in the fact. Two
very quick final questions. First of all, Brexit, which I referred to in the introduction, 2016, the Brexit referendum, if I'm not mistaken. That's almost 7 years ago. But, you know, we see the headlines about these interminable discussions about drawing up the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, and it seems to go on and on. There's some people in Britain that really have not given up yet and want to keep Britain somehow tied to Europe?
Oh, no question. There are many such people. I think probably including the opposition leader, certainly most of his party. They can't go back in fully, but they can agree to shadow most of the EU policies from the outside, which will, of course, make Brexit a much less successful proposition, because we'd be outside but still following rules set by someone else. I mean, you're right, it is incredible. 7 years nearly. But it's important to understand that the reason for that delay and the reason for the difficulties is that although the electorate gave a clear instruction, the people charged with implementing that instruction hated having to do it, detested the whole project, have never reconciled themselves to it, even to this day. And so whether or not they actually are scheming to go back in, they are deeply reluctant and psychologically unhappy. And the clearest example of this, and I cannot stress this too strongly for Australian viewers, because this is a point that is almost always missed abroad, even in the countries that are closest to us. In 2017, opponents of Brexit won a majority in the House of Commons through Theresa May's ill-judged election, and they then passed a law that said, in terms, we will not leave the EU except on terms that Brussels is happy with. Right? I mean, they didn't use that phrase. They said, we will not permit a no-deal Brexit. If you think about it, it's exactly the same thing. We will not leave, except on terms that you guys agree. Well, how do you expect the EU to respond to that? So, of course, all these difficulties, including the whole saga about the Irish border, which up until then Brussels had not tabled, suddenly came to the fore. You can't really blame the other side in a negotiation responding when you give them that kind of opening, which is why it does rather great when the same people who voted for that and who destroyed our negotiating position and created all of these problems because they didn't want Brexit to work, now have the gall to turn around and say, well, this isn't working out the way you promised. Well, of course it isn't, right? Because of the way they behave. But we will get there. And, you know, given the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis and so on, we have, we are not doing badly. We have other than in the lockdown year when we really suffered because of the excess of our lockdown, we had outperformed the EU in every other year since the referendum.
So finally, look, I feel after a serious conversation like this, Dan, we have an obligation to anybody who's stuck with us this far to look for an uplifting ending, if you like. But it's not easy, given the entrenchment of this dismal woke narrative in our schools, universities, corporations, mainstream media, indeed almost every corner of civic life. So I'm going to ask you a question to which I really hope the answer is no. Are we in the Free West past the point of no return?
I really hope the answer is no. I mean, but I can't put it any more to, I mean, by the way, yeah, thanks you blokes, anyone who's still with us. But yeah, you and I, and I guess most people watching this, grew up in a world freedom was spreading and where democracy was spreading and where we thought that, yeah, there were setbacks and it was fitful and patchy, but that broadly, the arc curved towards freedom. That is not the case now. Even before COVID, at some point between 2010 and 2015, this is measured by lots of different international outfits, the Democracy Index, the Economist Intelligence Unit, Freedom House, they all noticed the same thing, which was a rise in authoritarianism and a decline in the number of countries that could be called free societies or full democracies. The lockdowns have massively accelerated that. They have reversed the presumption of freedom, even in the most open societies like Australia. They habituated citizens to the idea that you needed to ask the state's permission to do the most basic things like enjoy your own property or travel. And I'm afraid it's going to be a very long time, if at all, before we get back to what we regarded as normal. But here's my attempt to end on a happy note. A little bit like people say, that the classic thing was the difference between science and religion is science can keep on being rediscovered empirically. Religion wouldn't just reemerge. You wouldn't suddenly have a second revelation from Moses or whatever. Whereas you do the experiment and it works every time. If free market ideas work, and if the idea of an open society that elevates personal autonomy works in the sense of making everyone richer and freer and happier, then once those ideas are out there, once they've happened, once they've been written down, they can always be rediscovered. The question is, how long until the rediscovery?
Indeed. Look, Dan, your columns in the Sunday Telegraph are worth the cost of subscription alone. There's plenty else of good material, of course, to read in the Daily and Sunday Telegraph, so thank you for that. Your YouTube video channel is always worth checking out. I'd say there are very few people in the House of Lords who have a YouTube channel that's such compulsive viewing as yours, so please keep that up, and we hope to see you back here in Australia before very long. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Nick. Always a pleasure.